It's a bit hard to believe now, but once upon a time, a new Star Wars movie coming out was a huge deal. Nowadays, thanks to several movies and an onslaught of TV shows, the Star Wars brand is omnipresent and not going anywhere anytime soon. But after the 1983 release of Return of the Jedi, there was a Death Star-sized void in the Star Wars galaxy, one that seemed like it would never be filled. When it became obvious in the mid-90s that George Lucas intended to bring his long-rumored prequel trilogy to life, there was no doubt movie fans young and old felt like the Force was strong with us, maybe more so than ever before. The Phantom Menace was to be the first of three, and in 1999 it entered our world as perhaps the most highly anticipated movie ever released. This thing came loaded with expectations that might have been impossible to meet. But most people just wanted to be back in that faraway galaxy, revisiting familiar characters and worlds while acquainting ourselves with brand new ones. A new Star Wars movie. Could you believe it? And though it would be telling a tale that many of us already knew, at least thought we knew, there was no denying that the very idea we'd be seeing that iconic crawl on a big screen accompanied by that gloriously loud boom of John Williams' theme was tremendously exciting. Prequel or not. Hell, the word prequel itself was something of a novelty, not nearly as commonplace as it is now. And if we were indeed going back in time, then at least we'd be seeing the origin story of one of cinema's most memorable villains. We heard the name Anakin Skywalker plenty of times. We knew he was Luke's father and Obi-Wan's apprentice and friend before being turned into the monstrous Darth Vader by the Emperor. But what exactly would that transformation look like? The notion of witnessing Anakin's devolution from hero to evil henchman was indeed a compelling one, as was the idea of seeing how the badass Obi-Wan was long before we met him. I'll not bore you with the details of this writer's first time seeing Phantom Menace, other than to say I saw it at 3 a.m. at Manhattan's legendary Ziegfeld Theater opening day. Well, opening morning. That should give you an idea of the level of anticipation coursing through these veins. Being in a sold-out theater filled with fully awake fanboys and girls at that ridiculous hour was a genuine treat for a while. No, friends, I did not like Phantom Menace that first fateful viewing, nor did I like it the second or the third time. We're not going to dwell on the past, just consider it some added context. Because recently I revisited Episode 1 for the first time in a long while for the purposes of this Star Wars Revisited series, and what better reason? As was the case with the original trilogy, it's nearly impossible to watch the film with a set of quote-unquote fresh eyes while shoving aside all prejudices and grievances, but it deserves as fair a shot at re-evaluation as any movie out there, especially considering it's arguably the most divisive movie in the franchise. Alright, maybe it's tied with The Last Jedi on that front. So, does The Phantom Menace look a little different with all those pesky expectations out of the conversation? Well, here's the deal. Phantom Menace is still a tough pill to swallow. Scene after scene brings the hope that George Lucas will get the movie on track, get some juvenile humor and caricatures out of his system early, deliver a narrative that brings more to the table than boring bureaucracy and standard getting-to-know-you character introductions, but he never does. The movie is meant to be a table setter, there's no doubt about that, with Lucas setting the stage for dire future events like the unraveling of the Republic and the extermination of the Jedis, not to mention Anakin's tortured embrace of the dark side. But at almost every turn, Phantom Menace is a stiff, unexciting affair filled with actors who look like they're trying hard to find inspiration in situations they seem uncomfortable in. When the movie does come to life, it's because of elaborate visual effects, not because characters we love are doing things we have a vested interest in. The original Star Wars movies are so unique in how they combine eye-popping spectacle with humor, heart, and wonderful personal moments, both major and minor. The Phantom Menace never seems to have a beating heart, and when it strives for the big emotional beats that truly grab the audience, it flopped, usually thanks to some dodgy acting, inane dialogue, and uninspired directing. This was George Lucas's first directorial effort since the original Star Wars came out in 1977. We know he was always very closely involved with most of his Lucasfilm productions, but returning to the director's chair after a 20-year hiatus clearly has its challenges.
Jar Jar is a key to all this. If we get Jar Jar working, because he's a funnier character than we've ever had.
Right off the bat, Lucas shows rust, opening with sequences that look like they were designed to show off CG production design as opposed to involving us in story. There's a boring formality to the way he compresses shots early and often, and you can't help but blame his over-reliance on shooting in front of a green screen stages for that. Of course, now we know it's very possible to rely on CGI and green screens and still deliver a well-directed picture, but Lucas doesn't seem to have any interest in composing an engaging image within the frame. He's gonna let the wizards at ILM do all the heavy lifting, and the movie's small handful of stimulating sequences feel as though they were handled by the second unit. But the director also needs to be in charge of his actors, and he has trouble in that department too. Even during his New Hope days, Lucas wasn't known as an actor-friendly director, yet he gets marvelous performances from pretty much all involved in that film, and if you take a look at his previous flick, American Graffiti, there's further proof of a genuine talent with a knack for getting the best out of his ensemble. Sadly, the performances in Phantom Menace are adequate at best, thoroughly unimpressive at worst, and that goes for humans and aliens alike. Liam Neeson and Ewan McGregor are naturally charismatic actors, and that natural screen presence goes a long way here, but Neeson often looks like he has very little investment in what's going on, while McGregor tries to gamely boost up an underwritten role. Natalie Portman, too, seems no match for Lucas's humdrum dialogue in a different direction. Even Sam Jackson is slightly off, frequently looking perplexed by his assignment, even though we know he genuinely coveted the opportunity to play a Jedi. The most human performance probably comes from Ian McDiarmid, who appears pleased as punch to be back in action as Palpatine, here depicted as an amiable politician who effectively hides a very dark side. McDiarmid has some fun with the role and consistently brightens up the screen when he's around, which isn't often enough. Also effective is Pernilla August as Anakin's somber mother. If Lucas is able to wring any actual drama out of a sad situation, Annika and Shmi are in. It's thanks to August's heartfelt performance. And as for Jake Lloyd, look, we're not here to pile on him. No one should be mad at Lloyd for his performance. Playing a young Anakin Skywalker was going to be a challenge for any young actor, and it's quite obvious early on that Lloyd isn't up to the task. Again, the blame must be squarely on Lucas's shoulders for casting Lloyd in lieu of someone who might bring some spirit to the part. This is young Darth Vader we're talking about here, and even though we meet him as an innocent child, there should be at least a little bit of an edge to him, especially considering the Jedi Council's wariness surrounding his apprenticeship. Watching him, all we can think is, this guy's gonna be Darth Vader? We're also not going to pile on Jar Jar Binks, well, not too much anyway. He's received 20 plus years of relentless bashing, and that's been plenty. But for the purposes of this revisit, let's not mince words. Jar Jar is a ridiculously ill-advised, unwelcome element in episode 1. To say this movie is often in dire need of some comic relief, and it is to underestimate matters, but Jar Jar is not the solution. He makes the silliness of C-3PO look positively dignified. Although if we can give any kind of compliment to the legacy of Jar Jar, it's that you can't deny Ahmed Best, the actor playing him, is bringing all the energy he can muster to the forefront. Lucas was always adamant that Jar Jar and his shenanigans were aimed at a younger audience, and maybe he does indeed work for that demographic, but you can't convince me that this was the best we could do. And the less said about Boss Nass, the better. These characters are thrust together in a story that takes a painfully long time to generate any kind of intrigue. The pressing issue at hand has to do with the Trade Federation, its blockade of Naboo, and its conspiracy with the dreaded Darth Sidious, who is using them as pawns in his quest to control the galaxy. As mentioned already, this movie is meant to be a table setter for the rest of the trilogy, but the Trade Federation storyline is a non-starter. Even if it's necessary in the grand scheme of things, it completely bogs the movie down whenever it's the focus. Add to that, the Trade Federation characters, the Neimoidians, are thoroughly dismal creations. We take them no more seriously than we do Jar Jar, and they're supposed to be the main antagonists of this piece. But that brings us to another looming issue for Phantom Menace. There really are no villains to root against. The Trade Federation obviously can't fit the bill, and Darth Sidious is more of a vague threat than a tangible bad guy. That leaves us with Darth Maul, who received so much hype prior to the film's release. The promise of Darth Maul being a flashy new baddie in the Star Wars universe was very enticing, but the movie barely utilizes him at all. He's in one fairly unexceptional dust-up with Qui-Gon in the middle of the film, and then he gets his big moment in the third act with a rousing lightsaber duel against the Jedi. The movie's best sequence, it brings life to Phantom Menace at a critical time, though of course it's frustratingly intercut with the bumblings of the Gungans and Anakin alike. Just when we're getting used to Darth Maul as an intimidating foe, he leaves the premises in pieces, and we bid adieu to the most captivating character in the film. The fact that his death hits harder than Qui-Gon's really tells you something. The third act has another saving grace, and that's John Williams' Duel of the Fates. A great track that still maintains immense power. Williams' score for Phantom Menace overall is far from his best, but Duel of the Fates just about makes up for it. He would go on to do much more memorable work in the next two prequels, however, once again becoming one of the main MVPs for the Star Wars series. In purely visual terms, Phantom Menace brings some superficial pleasures. Naboo, above and below the surface, is a lovely place to look at, and ILM's artists frequently give us enjoyable sights such as the frightful underwater monsters Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan encounter. The pod race is also an entertaining set piece, even if it does feel like it's just filling time and giving us a sorely needed action sequence in a movie that until that point hadn't been very thrilling. When it's all over and the droid army has been temporarily defeated and Boss Nass holds up that glowing orb thing, there's a pretty surreal feeling that comes over those of us who had been disappointed by the experience. For better or worse, this is how the prequel trilogy begins. It has established the core of our main protagonists moving forward, introduced a lot of excitable cartoon characters, and made us privy to more otherworldly politicking than was expected. There's no doubt that we can only go upward from here, right? To be fair, several of our viewers will disagree with the overall tenor of this review, and that's understandable. Through the years, I've met plenty of Star Wars fans who enjoy, or at the very least, accept the Phantom Menace. No one wanted it to be great some 20 plus years ago more than this writer, just as I wish it contained a number of happy surprises and pleasures upon a revisit. It does not for me. But it's not a bad thing that the movie has its fervent supporters. A generation of geeks grew up with the prequel trilogy as their focal point in all things Star Wars. Folks who couldn't imagine a world without Phantom Menace and will absolutely go to bat for the film time and time again. Love it or hate it, Phantom Menace is an integral part of this very special corner of the galaxy. It's a part of who we are, and you can't take that away from it. Now, send in the clones. When the dust had settled on the Phantom Menace, it was surely one of the most debated blockbusters of all time. In strictly box office terms, the film was a resounding success, grossing nearly $1 billion worldwide, which speaks to the repeat business and an overwhelming appetite for the resurrected franchise. But it had certainly disturbed the Force, dividing moviegoers and critics in a significant way, presumably ruining friendships and families in the process. Okay, perhaps that's a bit of an exaggeration, but make no mistake, it was a wild time to be a Star Wars fan in the wake of Episode 1. So many message boards and AOL chat rooms were littered with arguments over the film's pros and cons, and while it would often seem as though the naysayers were in the majority, there was no doubt the film had its ardent defenders who gave the film the benefit of the doubt, siding with George Lucas's point of view that The Phantom Menace was merely a table setter for darker things to come, and its juvenile atmosphere was warranted considering it was, first and foremost, a children's film. Obviously, this is a debate that rages on even today.
Are you an angel? What?
So unnecessary.
Regardless of which side of the aisle you fell on, everyone could agree that Episode 2 was still a must-see. It might even make or break the prequel trilogy for some, and those of us who resented the silliness of Phantom Menace were grasping to the idea that it would wipe the slate clean and act as a true Star Wars adventure. Crucially, it would give the series a second chance to introduce young Anakin Skywalker, who was less than an impressive figure in the first chapter, and even the movie's fans could agree on that point. Sure, it was subtitled Attack of the Clones, which didn't exactly add much hope.
Oh, what was it? What was it? Was it?
Attack of the Clones.
Is that real?
Yes. What do you think about that?
I don't know about that.
But hell, if it was a drastic improvement on the first one, they could call it whatever they wanted. So in May 2002, Lucasfilm debuted the second prequel film to a breathless world curious to see if we were going to be getting more of the same, or this trilogy's version of Empire Strikes Back.
Laugh it up, fuzzball.
First, good news. Attack of the Clones is a better movie than Phantom Menace, if ever so slightly. But its pleasures are still few and far between. It shows us more alien worlds, has a more adventurous spirit, it raises the stakes dramatically, and does a decent job gradually exposing the darkness lurking inside Anakin. Furthermore, it has an excellent score by John Williams, it has some engaging aliens and creatures, and best of all, gives us the Obi-Wan we've been waiting for thanks to a terrific Ewan McGregor,
Not good.
who is pitch perfect this time around.
We will find out who's trying to kill you, Padme. I promise you.
We will not exceed our mandate, my young Padawan learner.
Finally, there's precious little Jar Jar Binks, or the dreadful Trade Federation, who are laughable excuses for villains in Episode 1. It is more or less a considerably livelier affair than its predecessor, which is important because another movie with such a tedious pace would be a crusher. The plot is still heavy on political machinations and devious plots to undermine the Republic, but it's not so staggeringly monotonous as Phantom Menace.
Thank the Maker.
But Attack of the Clones carries over many of the same issues that plagued Phantom Menace. It's certainly busy throwing stuff at the screen, though it will never be mistaken for exhilarating or thrilling. The sense that we're not watching anything real looms over the entire film because, though some of the CGI is effective, there's hardly a scene that goes by that doesn't look exactly like it's the product of a computer. Actors are often stiff as they stand around awkwardly, usually murmuring plot points to each other in dire tones. You can almost picture the green screen behind them, a blank wall leading to blank stares. Once again, the dialogue is joyless and mechanical.
I've thought about her every day since we've parted, and she's forgotten me completely.
Lucas and co-writer Jonathan Hales deploy so much exposition in every scene that there's no real room for wit or genuine humanity left for the actors. While it's unfair to constantly compare the prequels to the original trilogy, it's impossible not to wonder what happened to the playful personality those films exhibited. Maybe it's the product of not having a rogue like Han Solo in the mix to bring some scoundrelly attitude.
I love you.
I know.
But more than that, it's the feeling that what we're watching is a formality, as if Lucas just had to make these movies, even if his heart wasn't quite in it. As was the case with Episode 1, most everyone in the cast looks as if they're having some difficulty rising to the occasion while delivering their lines.
You're a slave? I'm a person, and my name is Anakin.
only Ewan McGregor, Palpatine himself, Ian McDiarmid, and later in the film a charismatic Christopher Lee are able to bring some real personality to the forefront despite the odds against them. You must hand it to Ewan, he's a terrific Obi-Wan. It's one of the few things that the prequels as fans and detractors can agree upon. Often the lone shining light in the sea of ho-hum CGI and disinterested co-stars, McGregor is pretty much the best thing about Attack of the Clones, proving that a true movie star can rise above even the most banal material. He plays the role with self-assurance and even a little smirk here and there, injecting a sense of much-needed confidence into the veins of a movie that's quite lacking in the coolness department.
She went into the club, Master. Sorry, Master. Yes, Master. I try, Master. Master.
Hayden Christensen, in his first outing as Anakin, is not in the same conversation. And while we're not going to flog him over and over and over, as it's been done to death by plenty of others, it's impossible to ignore that George Lucas has now miscast Anakin Skywalker 2 times in a row. That would be impressive if it weren't so infuriating. Jake Lloyd we can forgive because he was so young and the character was on the sidelines for a large chunk of the running time, but Christensen is a bigger problem as Anakin is front and center in episode 2, and the movie demands he make a serious impression. He does all right, but it's not a positive one. I'm well aware that Hayden has his defenders, and maybe that's because his performance did improve in episode 3, but in Attack of the Clones, he's a detriment, not a standout. But this gets to a larger issue with the first 2 prequels, which is how Lucas himself views Anakin. Setting aside the performances of Lloyd and Christensen, what do we see when we watch him? Well, he's a young man who's brash, reckless, and often angry. He's also snotty, petulant, and whiny. Now, that may describe many a young man, but why does it have to describe this young man? His immaturity makes him more vulnerable to the dark side and the manipulations of Palpatine, of course, but Lucas could have approached Anakin's emotional weakness in a variety of ways that made sense while maintaining an aura of mystery and danger about him. Instead, we get a character who alternates between mopey dork and excitable diva.
I hate them!
In that regard, Lucas must be getting the performance he wants from Christensen, who gives us the future Darth Vader as grumpy male model. Revisiting the performance all these years later, it hasn't aged well or revealed layers that weren't perceptible back in 2002. We were all rooting for this unknown to bring an added dimension to Skywalker that was clearly missing in Phantom Menace, but like Lloyd before him, Hayden flounders mightily in this world. People might argue that Luke himself was petulant and whiny in the first Star Wars, but Luke was a nobody, going nowhere, stuck in a barren wasteland with nothing good on the horizon. You can't blame him for being a bit of a brat. Anakin is a powerful sorcerer with ambitions of being the greatest Jedi the galaxy has ever seen. Act like a grown-up, my man. The relationship between Anakin and Padme is supposed to be the beating heart of this movie. If we don't believe Anakin will do absolutely anything for her, we won't buy his eventual desperate turn to the dark side. Unfortunately, this heart doesn't have any blood in it. The scenes between the couple have all the flavor of a cardboard box. The 2 actors have 0 chemistry, and though Natalie Portman gives a decent enough showing, Christensen struggles to bring sympathetic life to Anakin's tortured puppy love. You watch them together and can't help but think she could do a lot better than this guy. If he weren't a supremely powerful Jedi, he'd be waiting tables at a cantina. Their conversations are now infamous for how strained and passionless they are.
From the moment I met you, not a day has gone by when I even thought of you.
Yes, we all remember Anakin's utterly ridiculous thoughts on sand and how it is so not like Padme, but there are plenty of scenes where the cringes are undeniable.
Please don't look at me like that.
The only help these 2 get comes courtesy of John Williams with a terrific effort here. Indeed, his love theme, Across the Stars, for Anakin and Padme is the very best thing about that romance. It's lovely and melancholy and beautifully hints at the doom lurking just around the corner. It's actually one of the best themes in the Star Wars universe. One thing Attack of the Clones has going for it is action. Uninspired action with now dated CGI, sure, but action nonetheless. The main reason Clones is more palatable than Phantom Menace is that it's not nearly as boring. Now, there's nothing so memorable as the pod race or Duel of the Fates in Clones, but at least the picture moves, it doesn't just sit there. The speeder chase that weaves through the skyscrapers of Coruscant is an entertaining spectacle, and the mayhem at the Colosseum in the third act is engaging enough, if not very memorable. At the very least, it's a unique setting for the franchise and provides us with a few eye-popping beasties. But I, for one, did not sign up for the Yoda versus Dooku fight, which was praised as being kick-ass when the film first came out, but has undergone something of a reevaluation in recent years. Simply put, Yoda and Christopher Lee bouncing around looks more goofy than anything else, and the overall dust-up between Dooku and the three Jedi doesn't nearly pack the same primal punch as the saber battle in Phantom Menace. As mentioned, Christopher Lee brings some class to the proceedings as Dooku, who is basically the movie's main villain, even if he doesn't show up until the third act. 2 movies in, and we have a major villain problem, as these movies don't really have any. Before Dooku, we get some fan service in the form of Jango Fett, who might briefly entice fans with his very presence, but never comes across as a legitimate threat. In the original trilogy, there was always the specter of Vader, nipping at the rebels' heels every step of the way, a truly imposing antagonist that we needed to see defeated. At this point, the prequels have not given us anything or anyone to really fear. There's just the knowledge that Palpatine will eventually overthrow the Republic and wipe out the Jedi. Our heroes never seem to be in any grave danger that they can't get out of. There's no rebellious spirit to be found, no genuine darkness threatening to blot out the light. Turns out, this wasn't the Empire Strikes Back of the trilogy, after all. When Attack of the Clones came out, it was a dispiriting experience for those of us who feared the worst, who hoped against hope that Phantom Menace was an improbable accident. With this entry, it became clear George Lucas had already made his bed, and the prequels were going to be far, far away from the Star Wars movies most of us cherished for years. Naturally, as time has moved on and new generations have grown up with the prequels, these films now have fans who weren't around for the initial reception and who see attributes some of us can't. That's not a bad thing. After all, we don't pretend to speak for everyone. Star Wars movies are meant to move us, inspire us, and ignite fires within our imaginations. Take us to places we've never been before, places we can't wait to return to. And if Attack of the Clones hits those notes for you, may the Force be with you. There's still one more to go, the finale. Will it be the Redeemer, the one that turns things around for good? Or will it be the final straw to break this bantha's back? So, we've come to the end of the line. It's 2005, and it's hard to believe 6 years have gone by since The Phantom Menace was unleashed upon the world, a film that can comfortably be referred to as one of the most debated blockbusters of all time. 3 years after, we made the acquaintance of the Gungans and Little Annie. Attack of the Clones came around to either turn things around completely or confirm our worst fears. That the new Star Wars movies were from a different galaxy altogether than the movies many of us grew up with. Clones may have relieved some of the general audience's concerns, but for many it indeed seemed to indicate that, sadly, the prequel trilogy was simply not on the same level as the beloved original trilogy. Too much focus on middling CGI. Another tepid presentation of Anakin Skywalker, exhaustingly goofy humor, and some truly boring dialogue to go along with a bevy of uninspiring performances. Suddenly, waiting 3 years for another Star Wars movie didn't seem like that big of a deal. But what were we gonna do? Skip out on it entirely? Of course not, because this was bringing us the moment we've been waiting for. Anakin Skywalker's final turn to the dark side. The true birth of Darth Vader and the end of the Jedi Order. While the first 2 movies were disappointments, well, for plenty of us anyways, we still had to see it through to the end. If Attack of the Clones was an improvement, however slight, on Phantom Menace, then it would make sense for Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, to be the best in the new trilogy. For what that was worth anyway. But the good news for everyone is that Revenge of the Sith is absolutely the best of the prequels. Compared to the first two, this one has it all. Decent visual effects, some solid action sequences, a handful of compelling lightsaber duels, an actual villain worth rooting against, and most crucially, a tolerable performance from Hayden Christensen as Anakin Skywalker. Revenge of the Sith, how you spoil us. Although, let's not rush to crown this movie as some kind of massive accomplishment, even if it looks like The Empire Strikes Back when weighed alongside the first two. Problems the other prequels had, this one does as well, including some very stale dialogue, depressingly chemistry-free romance between Anakin and Padme, and digital backgrounds that never feel real, to list a few. This is a movie that throws a lot of razzle-dazzle at the screen in an effort to knock our socks off in a way the prior two films failed to do. You get the sense that George Lucas is very aware that he has to stick the landing, and, at least in a handful of ways, he does. But Revenge of the Sith mainly gets points by virtue of the fact that we're no longer bogged down by the utter boredom and frustration that Phantom Menace and clones put us through. In those terms, Sith is an entertaining, sometimes even dramatically satisfying picture. And there is a darkness in the film that's fitting for the story it's telling. On that level, it's thankfully light years away from the silly shenanigans we associate with the first two. That's not to say the film is humorless, and some of that adolescent comedy is on display in the film's first act, mostly thanks to the battle droids and R2-D2. Tellingly, there's very little C-3PO in the film and next to no Jar Jar. Improvements all around. What humor there is usually comes courtesy of sly, sardonic Obi-Wan Kenobi, and we'll get to him in a minute. Revenge of the Sith signals it's learned somewhat from the mistakes of the past by thrusting us into the action right off the bat. Hardly any politicking at all. Can you believe it? Anakin and Obi-Wan have to rescue Chancellor Palpatine from the Separatist army and its leader, the newly introduced General Grievous, in what is clearly a staged kidnapping, but never mind that. The rescue attempt features some fun action and impressive visual effects, as well as the all-too-brief return of Christopher Lee's Count Dooku, who is one of the bright spots in Attack of the Clones, but here has his screen time and head cut off pretty quickly. By tossing us right into the fire, Lucas is obviously trying to give us the goods early on, having heard the complaints that the prior two prequels get off to woefully boring starts. Besides, there's a lot to get to in this film, so he's going to pack the screen with as much space operatics as he can. Of course, we're soon enough reminded of one of the series' main weaknesses, the relationship between Anakin and Padme. The stakes are raised here. Padme is pregnant with you-know-who, and Anakin's about to go through a roller coaster ride of fear, paranoia, and resentment. If we cared about these characters more, their journey to an inevitably tragic breakup would make for compelling cinema, but Lucas once again writes them in strictly one-dimensional terms, their romance no more convincing than the fake environments they often inhabit. While this is Natalie Portman's best take on Padme in all three films, she's still left with little to say or do. Hayden Christensen's performance is better here than it was in Clones, possibly because the many trials he goes through are by their very nature more interesting. Anakin is still prone to fits of whining and moping, but that is who he is, and there's just no changing that. But he does cut a somewhat imposing figure throughout the film, especially toward the end where his face is often a mask of tortured anger and regret. The Anakin presented in the prequels will never be mistaken for a great character, and that's understating the matter, but at least Hayden redeems himself and Anakin ever so slightly by giving a performance here that's at best not an impediment to the movie. Faint praise, but you gotta give him something. Continuing to be a strong presence is Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan, and while he proved he was the right man for the job in Episode 2, here he's fully taken the mantle and made the character his own. McGregor instills more humanity into the movie than anyone else by far, and despite all the whiz-bang CGI going on the screen, only truly lights up when he's in frame. The prequels would have been an even bigger mixed bag had they not nailed the casting of Obi-Wan, but thankfully they did, and when all is said and done, Ewan can be proud of the work he did on them. And we finally get a formidable villain in this trilogy. No, not General Grievous, who is impressively presented but not especially effective. That would be Chancellor Palpatine, who finally gets to go full Emperor in the third act. Yes, they call him Darth Sidious here, but he's always been the Emperor to me. It has, of course, been no secret that Palpatine has been pulling all the strings leading up to the events in Episode 3, but actor Ian McDiarmid has had to play it relatively cool throughout, smirking at the audience because we all know the obvious, while poor, overly emotional Anakin remains clueless. clueless. In Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine gets to do his smug patronizing for a while until the third act when he's fully transformed into the maniacal evil Sith Lord who has been lurking in the shadows all along. McDiarmid is once again a real treat to watch. The pro has known all along how to play this charlatan, and it's a satisfying moment when he's turned into the wrinkly demonic figure we all know and hate. Add to that, the scene effectively culminates in Anakin betraying Mace Windu and accepting his sad fate, which is to be a powerful henchman for the galaxy's most despicable bad guy. This is all prelude to the best sequence in the entire prequel trilogy, the hellish duel between Obi-Wan and Anakin on the lava-filled planet of Mustafar. Is it any surprise that Steven Spielberg evidently helped design some of the sequence during the pre-production, making it as engrossing and cinematic as anything else in the prequels? An event a long time coming. The desperate and chaotic fight actually feels quite monumental regardless of how you felt about the prequels up until this point. There was always a fascination regarding how Darth Vader turned into the monster behind the mask, at least in physical sense, and here we have the ghoulish answer. Anakin, dismembered and burnt to a crisp while his old friend looks on in pain, is some pretty rough stuff. And those of us who've yearned for the prequels to bring us some serious drama,
You were my brother, Anakin!
finally get it.
I loved you!
As a bonus, the sequence begins with Anakin killing off Newt Gunray and the rest of the Trade Federation. It's a real cherry on top to see the worst characters in the trilogy finally cut to pieces. Another contender for prequels MVP is, of course, John Williams, whose score for Sith is filled with notes of somber doom and heartbreak. His track for the final skirmish Battle of the Heroes is a gem and just as haunting as Duel of the Fates. Though his score for Phantom Menace is far from one of his best, his work on Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith is primo John Williams, and as such, the music elevates scenes which might otherwise suffer without his assistance. The entire third act is a compelling one with a series of dark twists and enough grim imagery to surprise even the most devoted prequel hater. Having Anakin slaughter a group of younglings, even if off-screen, is rather brutal and fully cements the character as being irredeemable, for the time being anyhow.
Execute Order 66.
The entire Order 66 sequence in which members of the Jedi are purged by the treacherous clone army is a striking one, but one can't help but think it would carry even more weight if we knew these characters better. We recognize them because they're often hanging around Yoda and Mace Windu, but they don't especially mean anything to us, so what could have been a really startling scene doesn't quite pack the punch it needs. Let's face it, we know the names of guys like Watto and Boss Nass, but most of us couldn't tell you the names of these fallen Jedi if we were paid to. One personal gripe here is, once again, fighting flipping flying Yoda, who just doesn't work on the level they're going for. He didn't look cool bouncing around in Attack of the Clones, he doesn't look cool doing it here, but there are enough Star Wars fans out there who dig it, that I can appreciate, and I might be in the minority, at least the vocal minority. Still, setting a majority of the fight between Yoda and Palpatine in the Senate proves to be a solid idea visually as we watch the figurative and literal demolishing of the Senate by the monstrous villain. Also, remember how much agonizing time we spent in that place during this trilogy? Good riddance. What Revenge of the Sith does relatively well is perform as the third act of a larger story, not unlike how Return of the Jedi contains one busy scene after another. Sith concludes the new trilogy with some necessary bravado, only intermittently breaking up the action with wooden interactions between protagonists. It's far from perfect. It's probably not what we had in mind when we dreamt about the promises of the trilogy when it was first officially announced, but it closes out the prequels with an appropriate amount of spectacle and melancholy. As the book closes on this revisit, it's fascinating to reckon with the prequel trilogy as a whole. The things that often stand out, at least for this writer, are usually negative. Jar Jar's antics, Anakin's sulking, several tedious confrontations, and lack of genuine drama and excitement, well, at least until the very end. But for someone who does not consider themselves a fan, good things can be found within it too. The music, in some of the performances, in the neat details of some of the alien creatures and their worlds. There's no changing what the prequels are, for better or worse. So those of us who initially felt betrayed by the films have no choice but to believe there's still good in them and to keep seeking that out. If it worked for the Skywalkers, maybe it can work for us too.